early morning reading live at 9:30 in the UK. Might be a different time where you are. And carrying on with J.B. Priestley's English Journey. We're on chapter 9. This is part 2. We're midway through. He's in on the Tyne up at Newcastle and Gateshead for this chapter. Good morning to Philip Hammond and Lisa. Nice to see you out there. And, of course, the lovely Julia, Sarah, other people coming online all the time. It's lovely to have you with me. Here we go. Yet again, the days are rolling by, aren't they? I don't know. It just seems to be incredibly swift. 1 minute I'm finished recording or doing the live from the English Journey, and the next minute, here we are. It's like, what happened in between? Did anything happen? Oh, yeah, did do a Vogue show last night, which was very energetic, my end. Hope it came over well with everybody else. Anyway, another sunny day that we're all locked up inside, can't do anything about. I have managed to sneak out and do a video. I don't mean sneak, but I mean have my little exercise and do my thing, which for tomorrow. Today's video is up. Can't even remember what today's video is. Oh, yes, it's the cycle ride with the bad audio. That's right. Hope people have enjoyed that. Hello to Fiona, Mary, good morning, Richard, Julia, and everyone. Hello to Terrier, 82 Box Hill. Is that where you are? Box Hill up in Surrey. Lovely, lovely setting, lovely part of the world up there. And imagine Box Hill not as busy as it usually is. Graham Roffey is there, so that's good. Fiona, I'm confused with Fiona Hammond and Mary. Is there? What is the story there? Audrey Forbes Hamilton, good morning, and Kevin Smith. Good morning, Richard and everyone. Hope you're all well. Yes, seem to be still here. Morning to Andy Stacey. Can't remember if I said that. This new muscle relaxer, says Ramiboo, is having its way with me tonight, so not sure how long I'll be able to make it through. Well, it's night time. You probably need the sleep. You don't feel you have to tune in. You can always watch afterwards, or just have a day off from the Vobes. Which would be good. Hello to John Blake. Good day to you, sir. Nice to have you with us this morning. So I'm going to carry on reading now. I've just got to work out where the hell I was. Oh yes, that's right. We got to Bob. We were talking about Bob the communist in the last chapter, and then we came to a natural point. Morton Lewis says the fog on the Tyne is all mine, peeing with rain. Oh, is it? Peeing with rain here in Madrid Central, yet by the end of May it will be in the 30s, June, and then in July it's going to be 40 centigrade. Wow. Linda Kane, good morning. Got here in time, almost. Been watching my night cam images of hedgehogs. Oh, marvellous. Rambo says, I really enjoy the book, which is great. Buenos dias a todos, says Morton. Box Hill, I'm named after the locomotive called Box Hill, which is the same as Fenchurch and Stepney. Aha. Oh, okay. Fair dues. Were you born in 82? How old does that make you? That's you're 20 years younger than me, so you must be 30-something. 30. Well, let's not dwell on ages, shall we? Okay, so let's carry on with our English journey and see where we get to. Thank you for joining me this morning. It was a raw, gloomy evening when I set out to find Bob's home. I think I shivered all the time from that internal cold, which was now beginning to make me feel miserable. In order to find Bob's little flat, I had to explore a large part of Gateshead, and there was nothing in this exploration to raise my spirits. Once off the long, dreary main road, there was nothing but names, not always easily seen, to distinguish one street from another. There seemed to be a great deal of Gateshead, and the whole town appeared to be been carefully planned by an enemy of the human race in its more exuberant aspects. Insects could do a better job than this. Their habitations are equally monotonous, but far more efficiently constructed. As the various industries of Gateshead are in a state of rapid decline, it is possible that very soon it will be in the position of the decayed medieval towns, those ports that the sea has left. But unlike those medieval towns, it will not, I think, be often visited by tourists in search of the quaint and the picturesque. Ye old Gatesford tea-rooms, I feel, will not do a brisk trade. The town was built to work in and to sleep in. You can still sleep in it, I suppose. When at last I found Bob in a neat little sitting room with a neat, smiling little wife, I told him that I didn't think much of his native town. Do you know what's the biggest town either on the railway or on the direct road between Newcastle and London? I bet you'll never guess. Well, it's this, Gateshead. You can catch a lot of people out with that. Gateshead's the biggest town between Newcastle and London. It's got more than 125,000 people in it, Gateshead has. And that, as he went on to admit, is about all Gateshead has in it. 125,000 people. But no real town. It has fewer public buildings of any importance than any town of its size in the country. If there is a town of like size on the continent of Europe that can show me a similar lack of civic dignity and all the evidence of an urban civilization, I should like to know its name and quality. No true civilization could have produced such a town, which is nothing better than a huge, dingy dormitory. I admit that it has only just across the river. It's only just across the river from Newcastle, which has some amenities, but Gateshead is an entirely separate borough. It has a member of Parliament, a mayor, 9 aldermen, and 27 councillors, and I hope they're all delighted with themselves. They used to build locomotives in Gateshead, very fine, complicated, powerful locomotives, but they never seem to have had any time to build a town. A place like this belongs to the pioneer age of industrialisation, and unfortunately the industry seems to be vanishing before the pioneers themselves have had time to make themselves comfortable. It's a frontier camp of bricks and mortar, but no golden west has been opened up by its activities. If anyone ever made money in Gateshead, they must have taken great care not to spend it on any of the town. And if anybody did make money in the town, what was it there for? And if anyone did make money in the town, what is it there for? It cannot be there for fun. Gateshead is not somebody's folly. How is it that a town can contain 125,000 persons and yet look like a sprawling, swollen industrial village? The answer to that is a dormitory for the working class. Perhaps at first they wanted nothing better, and now, by the time that some of them want something a great deal better, there is no money. Yet the town owes its existence on this scale to Britain's famous industrial prosperity, to which the town itself in turn contributed. The prosperity itself is now behind us, like the Victorian age, with which it is so closely associated, and now we may ask, what are the signs and marks of it left in Gateshead? To what must we point in admiration when we stand here in Gateshead and think of that vanished era? We can, of course, point to the 125,000 people, but there is nothing in their appearance or in their present situation in life to suggest that they are themselves the finest legacies of that era. True, some of them, like Bob, are fine, sturdy fellows, but it is just those fellows who condemn most thoroughly the whole dingy bag of tricks. Every future historian of modern England should be compelled to take one good, long, slow walk round Gateshead, and after that he can, at his leisure, fit it into his interpretation of our national growth and development. Bob had another visitor. He was a lad with a rather fixed smile a gentle face and voice, who sat up stiffly. He and I began arguing about Russia, and though he didn't convince me, I thought he made some very good points and talked well. During the argument I made one or two cheerfully outrageous remarks, and as I brought them out, I grinned across him with friendly fashion to indicate that I didn't expect to be taken too seriously. I thought at the time that he didn't appear to be responding too well to these grins, and I put it down to his earnest youthful enthusiasm, which forbade such trifling with the sacred subject of communism. It was only afterwards that I learned, to my horror, that the boy was blind. He was also semi-paralysed. Bob told me that the boy is now able to take first-year classes in adult education. Up to a year ago, he learned nearly everything from his mother, a working-class woman who read to him hour after hour. Now, of course, he can read Braille and finds his way about, and is active and very useful member of the community. I still think he's wrong about Russia, but I wish so remarkable a lad could find it possible to even be half so enthusiastic and inspired about England. Bob took me to the Bensham Grove settlement. It's established, and it has been for a good many years, in a detached house, the only one of that size I noticed in the neighbourhood. A little theatre has been built in the garden, and there are one or two other small annexes. Conditions are probably worse on the Tyne than anywhere else in this country, but it's only fair to say that in no other district are more determined efforts being made by means of these settlements and their various activities to help the unemployed. See the annual report of the Tyneside Council of Social Service. Bob showed me round this settlement, which appeared to be very busy indeed. There was a play on in the theatre, there were classes being held in various parts of the house, the notice boards were covered with lists and programmes. Bob's embryo concert party was ready for him, and we all moved into a little hut where there was a piano and a tiny stage. The young men were a very mixed lot. Some looked very clean, neat and healthy, others were very grimy and seedy specimens. They were so mixed that it would be impossible to generalise about them. I spent so long in that hut that I can easily recall their faces, which ranged from a handsome, ruddy youthfulness to dirty, young, old, toothless masks, and their voices, which included everything from a piercing tenor to a varied assortment of Tyneside grunts. One fellow, who afterwards laboriously went through a comic song and appeared to be a most successful comic man, except when it was his turn to be one, was specially noticeable, for if only for his odd look and a hand that was nothing more than a stump. I learned afterwards that he'd been an epileptic, and that a few years ago, having been left alone, I believe in the place where he worked, he'd fallen down in a fit, and his hand had gone into the fire. When he was discovered, the hand had nearly been burnt off. And since then he has had no more fits. Of such stuff were the comedians made in this grim concert party. They were not good musical or dramatic material, but my friend Bob, who was an old hand as a producer, wrestled stubbornly with them, taking them through choruses, harmonising quartets, and concerted numbers in which unshaven Tyneside lads turn themselves into an agonising burlesque of coy, fluttering maidens. Their best number, and I hope it went on all the night, was the opening chorus, in which, harried by the stamping, time-beating Bob, they thundered their conviction that happy times were here again. I can still hear them singing that chorus about happy times, can still see their fixed, anxious gaze, can still feel the little hut shaking beneath the tramp of their heavy boots, and can recall the ironic sting of the roaring mock welcome. Most of them may have been poor creatures, and Bob had no illusions about them, but I should like to be there when they could sing that chorus in good earnest. When the rehearsal was over, Bob collected a friend or two from the other parts of the settlement, and we went back to his home, where his wife had coffee and sandwiches ready for us. We began talking about these young men who had grown up in a workless world. Bob explained that he had had great difficulty in persuading them to join his concert party, which was for their benefit and not his own, as he had plenty of opportunities for this kind of work elsewhere, and that even when they had consented to join, it was not easy for them to get them to turn up punctually to rehearsals, to learn their songs and patter, and to make them submit even to the easiest discipline. Sympathy, he declared, was wasted on most of them because, unlike older men who had already known what steady employment and regular wages were, these youngsters did not fret because they had no work. There was no loss of self-respect, no anxiety with them. The others presented agreed with him. Most of these men, they assured me, were undisciplined and cared-free, the dingy butterflies of the back streets. They had no sense whatever of their own waste and tragedy. They were not at odds with their peculiar environment, by which time they had moulded their characters and shaped a way of living. They had little or no money, and never having had any, they didn't miss it. They cadged cheerfully from relatives, and so managed to find a few coppers for cigarettes and the pictures, and a bit of betting. Somebody recently had got up a free film show for them, but hardly any of them had attended it, and they had been seen that very night coming back from the ordinary cinema. They lived below the level of worry. They were not citizens, though some of them soon would be husbands and fathers. If the time ever came that they had to work hard and obey orders, it would find them resentful and untrustworthy. Having grown up in one kind of world, they would be puzzled and probably annoyed by another kind of world. They knew nothing about responsibility. They were the new playboys of the Western world. But of course, they did have to play in Gateshead, which was obviously had been designed only to work in. They live, in short, in a workshop that has no work for them. They are children of an industrialism that has lost its industry, of a money-making machine that has ceased to make money. If they live mean, foolish little lives, whose fault is that? Citizens must have a city. Seen at such close quarters, an idle, irresponsible seen at such close quarters as idle, irresponsible corner boys, they do not vanish as tragic figures. They are tragic to their parents, and we can only hope that they may seem tragic some day to their children. There was a railwayman present, and he told us that only that very day he had been called in to give an exact account of his duties. They thought they might be able to give me the sack, man, he explained. Oh, sorry, I forgot it's all in Geordie accent. I can't do a Geordie accent. They thought they could give me the sack, man, he explained. But when I told them all I did, they thought better of it. There used to be 3 different men. Aye, man. Aye, man. There used to be 3 different men. Sorry, crap at the accent. Doing what I have to do by myself now. He went on to tell us, no doubt with some humorous exaggeration, that the company's policy of keeping on old employees he told on to tell us, no doubt with some humorous exaggeration, that the company's policy of keeping on old employees as long as it could and of not taking on any young men had resulted in a droll state of affairs in which you had to go round looking for a man strong enough to undertake anything that required a bit of muscle. If a heavy package arrived, the place had to be combed for a man still young enough to handle it without danger to himself. "We've all got one foot in the grave, man," he cried. His father, His father and grandfather had been railwaymen before him. He said, but railways were railways in those days. Gateshead, of course, was a great railway town. We're all proud of our splendid railway systems, but I have never caught the wildest enthusiasm among us beaming with pride at the thought of our railway towns. I left this specimen with them without regret, though I was sorry to see the last of Bob. When I got back home, I sent him a copy of a book of mine, and at once he sent me a watercolour sketch of his, the one of the Tyne Bridge, that I liked best, though I'm sure it was his favourite too. Of such stuff, it seems, are dangerous red agitators made, the fellows who ought to be locked up. I shall not join Bob's party yet, but I wish I had a party fit for him to join. That's an interesting statement. I won't join the Communist Party, but I wish I had a party fit for him to join. Interesting. Anyway, there we are. Assuming you're a sir, I beg your pardon, there was a Gateshead in New South Wales, a suburb of Newcastle, a city north of Sydney. Oh, right. Oh, okay. How interesting. Hello to Barry Stevens. All his comments on kids are ironic, given that a few years later they would give up their lives in World War II. That's interesting, yes, because the way he describes them, actually, and he describes them all as lanky and thin and toothless and all of this, yeah. And it's hard. Then you sort of think of this motley crew who will be signed up in the war fighting for our lives. Yeah, it's that is a very interesting thought. I remember once seeing this photograph. I can't remember where it was. It was somewhere like Newcastle, but it was one of these big towns. It might have been Leeds or somewhere. And this was a photograph taken in something like 19 when was it? It was about 1908, something like that, 1908. And it was by a fountain. And there's all these kids, poor kids, some of them with shoes, some of them without shoes, all in sort of jackets and, you know, they're not their Sunday best, but their next best. But they were very scruffy kids. And they must have been about, I don't know, 10, 11. And they're all lined up, girls and boys. And they're all grinning and gurning at the camera in this one picture. And they all look like they've got not a care in the world as they sit there. I mean, poor as anything. Terrible, you know, kids from the slums. 1908, 1910, something like that. And as you looked at that picture, or as I looked at that picture, I was very aware that in 6 years, these kids who would be turning of age would be going over the top in the First World War. And many of them, if not all of them, perhaps not the girls, but the boys, would not have lived much longer. And there you look at these pictures of these kids 6, 7 years earlier, and they just look so innocent, so charming, so full of life and verve, even in their poor condition, desperately wanting to be alive. It was a very poignant photograph because you knew what was coming for them. We don't know what's happening tomorrow. We hope we're going to get out of this lockdown at some point. But there's sometimes when you get those pictures and you know exactly what's happening for them. So yeah, I take your point exactly. Those same loafers who haven't got a care in the world and can cadge their fags and this, that and the other would be going out with the BEF or whatever, perhaps trying to get back from Dunkirk a few, what are we talking about, 1933, 6 years later, 6, 7 years later, they're stranded on the beach at Dunkirk being shot at by Messerschmitts and Junkers. It's quite sobering thought, isn't it? This is where history can be, history can be very sobering. There's so much of what's gone before that hopefully shapes us and makes us into better people, but who knows? Morton Lewis says Priestley was a socialist snob. Priestley was a staunch socialist. Was he? To be honest, I don't really know much about Priestley himself. I'm enjoying his observations, whether they are outrageous and but they are of the time. You know, one can only take that on board that they were of the time. No comments on the kids are ironic, given that a few years later. Yes, that's right. His comments. Sorry, I read that wrong. He sounds like a bit like an evening out on the Tyne in the late 80s, but the nights were fun. They have beer, or had, a Newcastle exhibition, a real toxic brew. Right, we'll do a bit more. As an interlude, a tedious, brief scene, I will now present the episodes of the Newcastle Hotel Register. Throughout this journey, I was always anxious to avoid the attentions of the local newspapers, not because I dislike provincial press, I believe in it, and always buy and read a local newspaper wherever I go, but because I wanted to be able to prowl about a little without being attended by photographers and interviewers. But I am no Montague Norman or film star, so I didn't travel under a fictitious name or wear blue spectacles. As a rule, I did not entirely escape the local newspapers, but they found me only when most of my work in their town had been done. In Newcastle, I was unlucky, for the press was on my track almost at once. The first thing they did was to embroider the simple, really meaningless tale of the Hotel Register. In fact, they didn't embroider it, they invented the whole tale. On the day of my arrival at this hotel, I was asked to sign the register. I was in a hurry, and I did what most other guests on that page had done, and indeed what one nearly always does, and that is, instead of putting down my full address, I put down the name of the city, London, thus following the Birminghams and Wakefields and Stockports of the other guests. "Full address, please," the clerk murmured mechanically. "Oh, it doesn't matter," I muttered. "Moving off, that'll find me." Like the gentleman from Birmingham, Wakefield and Stockport, I was merely saving myself trouble, and it never occurred to me that any particular significance would be attached to this idle remark, nor was it, I think, by the clerk. It was the press, the artful promptings of reporters, that turned this into an amusing incident. Before I left Newcastle, I had read 5 different versions. I had read 5 different versions in local and London papers of this amusing incident. The only likeness between these 5 versions was that they all introduced me and the Hotel Register, and they were all untrue. In 3 of them, I was made to behave like a pompous ass. In 2 of them, like a conceited buffoon. There was nothing to be done about it. The fables had been sent out on their travels, and I could not arrest them. I do not believe there was the tiniest spark of ill nature in the fellows who concocted these little yarns. They probably wished me well, and didn't realise that they might be doing me mischief. The matter itself is, of course, a triviality, and would not be worth mentioning if it were not a good example on a small scale of a very mischievous. There's 2 ways of saying mischievous and mischievous, and I think mischievous is the English way of saying it. Mischievous, I think, is the American way of saying it. Very mischievous tendency in the modern press, which must have its amusing incidents. These spicy little dishes are only served up to the public because it is believed that the public is interested in the person in question. But it never seems to occur to reporters and their sub-editors that the effect of a slightly heightened and distorted anecdote may be a very bad one, helping to prejudice thousands of readers against the innocent victim in it. The little episode is worth mentioning too, because it is also an example of on a small scale of how current history is made. To read 5 different and untruthful versions of a tiny incident in which you yourself are concerned, not 2 days before, and then this is to become even more sceptical than ever. Such is news, and news soon hardens into history. Fortunately, I shall never be a historical personage, otherwise the very schoolchildren might one day be compelled to learn how I ran screaming up and down this hotel lounge, flourishing the register. Quite what that was all about, I have no idea, but there we are. He was obviously getting his own back at some tittle-tattle they'd written up in the newspapers about him. Bless his little socks. Poor old JB. Right, now this one, the next bit, I just wanted to see where I could finish on this one because it's quite a lengthy bit. It was my bookseller friend who took me down to the Tyne. The rain had gone, but the morning was cold and rather misty. I had nothing to do most of the time but stare through the window of a saloon car, and I doubt if I was fit to do that, heavily dosed up as I was on that belladonna mixture. I have no doubt that the subjective element against which I warned you at the beginning of this chapter now comes into play, blurring the scene. But I will make the most honest attempt to put down what I thought I saw that day. We began by running along the old quayside as far as we could go. I noticed nothing but a lot of miserable fellows hanging about, probably looking for the chance of a job. When we turned away from the water's edge, on our way to Wallsend, I found that the ebony delight of Newcastle was left behind. These were all the mean streets. Slatternly women stood at the doors of wretched little houses, gossiping with other slatterns, or screeching for their small children who were playing among the filth in the roadside. You would have thought that New Bridge Street was miles away in another city altogether. Between Wallsend and North Shields, the road was confusing, and the landscape more confusing still. It was strewn with broken-down pitmen's cottages and the ruins of higgledy-piggledy allotments. I never saw a bit of country that was in more need of tidying up. If any decent woman had been shown a room half that bad, she would have itched to be at it. There's a bit of male chauvinism for you. If T.S. Eliot ever wants to write a poem about a real wasteland instead of a metaphysical one, he should come here. We are all fond of saying that people get used to things, but I do not believe that anyone can look complacently at a dirty mess of this kind. It must have been depressing folk for years. All round this hideous muddle there was industry. All round this hideous muddle, where industry had had a dirty black meal and had done no washing up, there must have been schools in which children were learning about Simon de Montfort and Keats and the properties of potassium. The fathers of many of these children were wondering how they were going to get through another idle, useless day. And here was this great mass waiting to be tidied up, and determined in the meantime to take the heart out of anybody who looked at it. I do not say that the scene as a whole was lacking in certain elements of the grim picturesque. On the right there were sudden strange glimpses of the river far below, like a deep gulf in which a thick-set mist moved sluggishly. The sight of it lifted the heart at once, probably because one accepted it as a symbol of escape. There was the estuary, water and air and light, and somewhere not far away was the wide sea itself, a window upon the world. There were glimpses, too, of the great cranes and other paraphernalia of yards, reminding you that these Geordies, stocky, toothless fellows in caps and mufflers, cursing in their uncouth accent, could do a grand job of work whenever they were given a chance. I could not lend a hand with that work, let alone assume for a moment that I cannot appreciate its grim strength and mastery, its Promethean and volcanic grandeur, or that I moved through this setting for it like a flinching minor poet dreaming of roses. Labour of this kind, bending iron and riveting steel to steel, is the real thing, man's work. Grim and ugly as it may be, nevertheless, if this riverside had been black and shattering with smoke and din of tens of thousands of men hard at it, for the Commonwealth and for their own decent comfort and self-respect, I think I would have found it wildly inspiring, a scene to overtop any poor praise of mine. There was, of course, some good work going on, but what chiefly caught the eye were the evidences of past greed, now sated here and ravening elsewhere, and present indifferences and neglect. Silent, rusting shipyards are not an inspiring spectacle, neither are rows of broken-down cottages and forlorn allotments. If all these things are now useless to the industrial and social body as nail parings and hair combings, they might at least be decently tidied away. They are, I gather, partly the result of severe surgical operation in our post-war economy. Neither the patient nor the operating theatre seems to be cleaned up, and the resulting mess is not a pretty sight. We crossed from North Shields to South Shields in a fat little ferry boat, and on our way over, my companion, whose father had been a marine engineer and who had been apprenticed to the trade himself, pointed this way and that up the raw gulf of the river and told me what a pitiful small tonnage of ship there seemed to be about now. We ran up a sharp street into the main square of South Shields, which, I'm delighted to add, seemed to be a pleasanter town now that I remember it being when I was there in the war. But it has, I believe, a larger middle-class population than most of the other neighbouring towns. We had lunch in a deserted and very warm hotel dining room. The sunlight was struggling through to the square when we went back to the waiting car, and we were now ready to explore the towns on the south bank between here and Gateshead. My companion was anxious that I should have a talk with one or two men of his acquaintance in Jarrow and Hebburn, and I might as well confess here that we never succeeded in finding any of those men, though we spent most of the afternoon asking our way in a labyrinth of little streets, trying to find them. But if we didn't see the men, we certainly saw the towns, though we did not find our way into them without difficulty. They are plainly there along the river bank, and I was with a Tyneside man who knew them, but nevertheless we still had to ask our way several times and twist about and turn back before we contrived to reach Jarrow from South Shields. I suspect that devilish agencies were at work to prevent us from seeing Jarrow and Hebburn, but they did not succeed. We managed at last to thread our way through a maze of monotonous streets, complicated by a spider's web of railway lines, and then went round and round Jarrow, chasing two elusive officials. I will not add that these two officials had vanished into thin air, because there is no thin air in Jarrow. It is thick air, heavy with enforced idleness, poverty and misery. God, he doesn't like it, does he? Turbo raining in cold Madrid. Morton is a sunny Birmingham today. Turbo. Good morning. Sorry I'm late. No problem. The most remarkable giant liner in the world is probably the Mauretania, for she is nearly 30 years old and is still one of the fastest vessels afloat. Her record for both speed and safety is superb. We are very proud of her. Now the Mauretania was launched at Wallsend, just across the river from Harrow, and she has lasted longer than Jarrow. She is still alive and throbbing, but Jarrow is dead. As a real town, a piece of urban civilization, Jarrow could never have been alive. There is easily more comfort and luxury on one deck of the Mauretania than there can ever been at any time in Jarrow, which even at its best, when everybody was working in it, must obviously have been a mean little conglomeration of narrow, monotonous streets of stunted and ugly houses, a barracks cynically put together so that shipbuilding workers could get some food and sleep between shifts. Anything, strange as it may seem, appears to have been good enough for the men who could build ships like the Mauretania. But in those days, at least they were working. Now, Jarrow is a derelict town. I had seen nothing like it since the war. I had put derelict shipbuilding town into Wander Hero, which I presume is a book of his, and called it Slakeby. Some people thought I overdid it a little in my Slakeby chapter. I assure people that the reality of Jarrow is far worse than anything I imagined for my Slakeby. It far outran any grim expectations of mine. My guidebook deserves one short sentence to Jarrow. A busy town, 35,590, has large engineering works, has large ironworks and shipbuilding yards. It's time that this was amended to an idle and ruined town, 35,590 inhabitants, wondering what is to become of them. Had large ironworks and can still show what is left of shipbuilding yards. The Venerable Bede spent part of his life in this neighbourhood. He would be astonished at the progress that it has made since his time, when the river ran, a clear stream, through the green valley. There is no escape anywhere in Jarrow from its prevailing misery, for it is entirely a working-class town. One little street may be rather more wretched than another, but to the outsider they all look alike. One out of every 2 shops appeared to be permanently closed. Whenever we went there, men hanging about. There were not scores of them, but hundreds of thousands of them. The whole town looked as if it had entered a perpetual penniless bleak Sabbath. The men wore the drawn masks of prisoners of war. A stranger from a distant civilization, observing the condition of the place and its people, would have arrived at once at the conclusion that Jarrow had deeply offended some celestial emperor of the island and was now being punished. He would never believe us if we told him that in theory this town was as good as any other, and that its inhabitants were not criminals but citizens with votes. The only cheerful sight I saw there was a game of Follow My Leader that was being played by 7 small children. But what leader can the rest of them follow? After a glimpse of the riverfront, that is, of tumbled-down sheds, rotting piles, coal dust and mud, we landed in Hebburn, where we pursued in vain another man that we wanted. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, Hebburn. Hebburn is another completely working-class town. It is built on the same mean, proletarian scale as Jarrow. It appeared to be even poorer than its neighbour. You felt that there was nothing in the whole place worth a £5 note. It looked as much like an ordinary town of the size as a dustbin looks like a drawing room. Here again, idle men, and not unemployable casual labourers, but skilled men, hung about the street, waiting for doomsday. Nothing, it seemed, would ever happen here again. Yet, oddly enough, a great deal is happening here, more in some directions than has ever happened before. Its Council of Social Services possesses a particularly energetic secretary, and in this stranded hulk of a town there are courses on history and economics, and irony, of course, and literature, an orchestra, and ladies and gentlemen's choir, 2 girls' club for handicrafts, gymnasium classes, a camping and rambling club, and play centres for children. It is possible that Hebburn is coming nearer to civilization in its poverty than it ever did in its prosperity. Probably these cultural activities are breeding a generation that would not be tolerated in old Hebburn, even though it offered them work and even if it offered them work and wages again. If this should be true, then at least in one direction there's been a gain. But consider the gigantic loss. It is not merely that 2/3 of the town is living on the edge of destitution, tightening its belt another hole every month or two, but that its self-respect is vanishing. For these are working towns and nothing else, and that it sees the sky forever darkening over it. We went down to the social centre, which after some difficulty we found in a couple of huts by the side of a derelict shipyard. A little gnome-like man, grandly proud of everything, showed us round. There were places for carpenting and cobbling, a tattered library, and a newly finished hut for their twopenny whist drives and dances. I had an odd feeling all the time that I was looking at a camp just before the front line in some strange new war. This centre possesses a boat of its own and has already achieved some fame, and our gnome-like friend offered to go down to the water's edge where it was moored and show us. To get there we had to cross the derelict shipyard, which was a fantastic wilderness of decaying sheds, strange mounds and pits, rusted iron, old concrete and new grass. Both my companions knew about this yard, which had been a spectacular failure, which over $1 million of money had been lost. They had queer stories to tell of corruption in this and other yards, of lorry loads of valuable material that were driven in at one gate and signed for, and then quietly driven out of another gate, of jobs so blatantly rushed for show purposes that in the last weeks the wooden pegs were still being used in place of steel rivets. As we came to the sullen waterfront, we could hear the noise of the electric riveting from the few yards working across the river, but both of them agreed it seemed quiet compared with the deafening din of the riveters in the old days. There was one ship in the yards now, where there used to be 20. Down the Tyne we could see the idle ships lying up, a melancholy and familiar sight now in every estuary across the coast. There is hardly anything that brings you more sharply in line with the idiotic muddle of our times than the spectacle of these fine big steamers rusting away in rows. We have these vessels doing nothing. We have coal for their bunkers, our ports are filled with ship's officers and men out of work. We have goods that other people need, and across every stretch of the ocean are goods that we need. And still the ships are there, chained and empty, rusting in the rain, groaning in idleness day and night. But one boat is not idle on that river. This is the one we looked at now, as she creaked at her moorings. She was an old ship's boat, and as she was in poor shape, she was brought for the social centre for £4. She was bought for the social centre for £4. The men themselves patched her up. She carries a sail, and 10 men usually get out in her, working 3 lines. The fish they bring back, and they had some good catches, though the Thames estuary is no Dogger Bank, is not sold but distributed among the unemployed men's families. She's called the Venture, and a better name could not be found for her. I do not know anywhere on this journey that I saw anything more moving and significant than the old patched boat, which hung for years from davits of a liner, but is now the workless men's venture, creeping out with some tide to find new fish. The effort she represents, is something more than a brave gesture, though it is that all right. It means that these men, who were once part of an elaborate industrial machinery, have now been cast out by it, are starting all over again, far away from the great machine, at the very beginning, out at sea with a line and a hook. And it will not do. These are not simply fishermen any more than this island of ours is one of the South Sea Islands. They are skilled children of our industrial system, artisans and men with trades with their fingers, and every time they go out and fumble frozenly with their lines and hooks, they declare once again the miserable bankruptcy of the system. The venture may be their pride, but it is our shame. I'll just see how many... Yeah, we're nearly there. Chilled and aching, I stood by the side of the river and looked at the mud and coal dust below, at the slimy, decaying wood piles on either side, at the tumble-down sheds above, and across at the motionless cranes and idle ships now fading in the mist. And as I looked about me, I remembered the miserable huddles of mean streets and dirty little houses behind me, and the grimy wilderness we'd passed through during the morning. And I asked myself, with failing courage and hope, whether the whole Tyneside had not taken a wrong turning. There was a time when this must have been one of the prettiest of our green estuaries. With a clear sky above him and clear water below, man could have been happy here in the old days, content to live in peace without cinemas and newspapers and racing dogs and betting slips, or even without rambling clubs and music societies and gymnastics and lectures on the economic history of England. He would not have known, the lucky fellow, that it had an economic history. I am not given to sentimentalising the distant past, and have often argued, and often ferociously, with those who do, and have seemed to gloss over its ignorance and brutality of the. I am not given to sentimentalising the distant past, and have argued often and ferociously with those who do, and have seemed to me to gloss over its ignorance and brutality and the narrow limits of its life. But I could see men reasonably content, if not happy, in this clean, verdant, river-sea country with its fresh salt airs. Well, there is no more green estuary now. The whole riverside wears a scarred black face. It is not casually, but ruthlessly ugly, as if every charm had been deliberately banished. But there was the new grim fairy tale of industry. There was work. There were rising wages. England would not be England we know if the Tyneside were not the Tyneside we know. Coal, millions of tons of it, had been poured out down this channel. Great ships had been built and repaired. Engines had been constructed and sent away by the thousand. There had been enormous fortunes spent in wages and material, in profits and dividends. But still I wondered, as I stood there shivering a little, whether it had all been worth while. Here was the pleasant green estuary, blackened and ruined, it seemed, for ever. Here was a warren of people living in wretched conditions, in a parody of either rural or urban life, many of them now without work or wages or hope. Not half the men their peasant ancestors were. They seem to have gained as little as the befouled river itself, and the fortunes, the piles of gold that the alchemy of industry had conjured from this stream and filth and din. Where were they? What great work, I asked myself, owes its existence to those vast profits, those mounting dividends? What science and arts had they nourished? What new graces had they added to English life in return for what they had taken away from her? The ramshackle telephone exchange at the back of my mind put the call through, and I heard a bell ring, but there was no reply. Very close, very close. Page and a half. It's very grim reading this. On the way back from Hebburn to Gateshead, which was a journey among the very scrag ends of industrial life, we passed no less than 3 funerals, each of them with a long black tail to it. Here, though, you can no longer live well, but you can still die and be buried in style. I'd already noticed that although so many shops were closed in Jarrow and Hebburn, the shops that sold funeral wreaths were still open, True, the specimens they exhibited in their windows had a white waxiness that was now somewhat fly-blown, as if dissolution had anticipated their ultimate arrival at the grave and was becoming impatient and so setting its mark upon them, but they were there and costing good money. It seemed as if death provided the only possible spree left here. Once you had escaped from its narrow life, your cold body was treated like an honoured guest and made a royal escape. There were flowers for the dead, if none of it for the living. All the neighbourhoods turned out to witness this triumphant emigration. Here was something that asked for what was left of one's best clothes. Here was the remaining bit of pageantry. If you could no longer work and found it hard to play, you could still turn out and march to the cemetery. My companion told me that the district had always had a weakness for lavish funerals, its folk growing reckless and opulent in the presence of death. Years ago, he told me, his father, weary of seeing poor widows flinging their money away in this fashion, had had a few short, sharp words with some of the local undertakers, who were not above encouraging the bewildered creatures to be lavish and outdo their recently bereaved neighbours. As we passed along these dragging funerals, I thought how hideous we have bedizened the face and figure of death. The major events in our lives are unfortunate for our dignity. We come into this world to the accompaniment of shrieks of pain and the reek of disinfectant. We are married among idiotic ceremonies and silly whispers, giggles, nudges, stares and stale jokes, and we leave this world in the company of wired flowers and dyed horses, commercial gentlemen with professionally long faces and greeny black suits that do not fit. And we can only say goodbye to the bodies we have loved in a monstrous atmosphere of black bogeymen on parade. Thou, thy worldly task has done, I muttered, to the last and grimmest coach. Home art gone and taken thy wages. But there were probably no wages. Home he had gone and taken his dole. And where was his home? Where was the fellow whose cold carcass had been screwed down inside that yellow tapering box? Was he in deep sleep forever? Or was he watching in amazement the procession? Or was he already struggling into another life, perhaps not lacking so many elements of justice as this one, somewhere beyond Sirius? In Gateshead, on our way back, we passed some little streets named after the poets, Chaucer and Spenser and Tennyson, and I wondered if any poets were growing up in those streets. We could do with one from such streets, not one of our frigid, complicated, sniggering rhymers, but a lad, not one of our frigid, complicated, sniggering rhymers, but a lad with such a flame in his heart and a mouth that at last he could set the Tyne on fire. Who would push one out? Not I, for one. Blimey, that's the end of that chapter, chapter 9. We're on chapter 10, To East Durham and the Tees. It just gets grimmer and grimmer. I had no idea that it's going to be as grim a read as it was, but it's an incredibly interesting snapshot, albeit perhaps snobbish, from Priestley, but it is an interesting snapshot of the grime and the destitution that we had got to in the 1930s, and perhaps we just have no concept of really what it like, the industries that had raised up to a pinnacle, given people all this work, and then crashed, leaving everybody stranded, all the eggs in one basket gone, with no eggs left. It clearly was absolutely devastating time, and I guess that's why he set out, and which doesn't, there's no hint of that really at the beginning when you start to read that he is wanting to look at what's happened to England and compare what was 20, 30 years ago with what was happening in the 30s. And so that's really interesting. I mean, this the devastation seems to become worse and worse the further north he went, where the workers were. Turbo I'm glad I didn't live in the 1930s. No, absolutely. And it's only 90 years ago. I agree with his disdain for morticians. Well, yes, and I do very much, because having buried my father, that's not true at all. He was cremated. But having dealt with the death of my father, you pay all that money, really, for a couple of, for 6 dodgy blokes in black suits to bring a box with a corpse in it, put it on a table, and one other bloke just to bow, and that's it, really. I mean, they may have arranged for the cremation, but I could have arranged with the cremation myself. You suddenly realise that it's people just making money, because you don't know, and we don't deal with death very well at the moment in this country yet, because death is very much kept as a separate entity. It's interesting. They try and upsell death. Yeah, they do. There's one mortician I like, a YouTuber, says, oh, yes, I know who you mean. My grandfather was born in 1902. Any time you were having fun, he'd tell you about the Depression. Yeah, no, I can well believe it. Hi from day 25, lockdown in New Zealand. Good morning to you. Yes, but I think it's important to read these things. I think it's very important. I mean, this may be slightly, it is his account, and it's one person's account, and you cannot knock one person's account, whether he is biased in one way or snobbish in another way or whatever. But I think it's important to know these things, because knowing our place against other tragedies of life, it helps you to put things into perspective. We often think that we're hard done by, but there's always a time, and there's always a period that was worse. I mean, we do live, apart from this particular weird situation with the virus, we never lived in a better time. There's never been a better time to be alive, because of, here we are in lockdown, and most of us, I would hazard a guess, most of us will be okay, and we still have the internet. We still have idiots like me coming on, reading to you or trying to entertain you, making videos. We still have, the shops are open. It's interesting. But it was interesting, the comments that I thought was fascinating, when he was talking about standing there looking at the Black River and the mess of the houses and the architecture and everything, and thinking, this is really grim, and going back to ancestral man and ancient man, and thinking he must have had a pleasant time. Have we done something wrong with our industrial stuff? And then you look at globalization today and where we're going, and sometimes you do think, well, to be a little farmer, peasant farmer, growing your crops and what have you, and not having a lot of these worries would be quite nice. Only to be, of course, wiped out by the Black Death, and to be starving when the crops didn't grow. So yeah, we can always look back and think there's elements of the past that are good, but we could fashion the future, perhaps taking the best of the past and the best of the present, instead of just taking the worst of things. Anyway, even with this virus, we're quite lucky. Yes, absolutely. So I like him and her. Oh, yes. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for watching this morning. Another hour done. We've got chapter 10. I think there's 12 chapters, so there's 2 more to go. And there's a sixth of the book left. So we will get through this, we'll finish it, and it'll be quite a nice little achievement. Thank you for watching and listening and accompanying me as I read the book. It's been great fun to do so, even if it is showing the grimmer side of life. But It's fascinating. It would be interesting 90 years later, as I've said before, to follow in his footsteps and see how in those 90 years what has changed. And I've driven to Gateshead before, seen the Angel of the North. I have been into Newcastle but didn't really see the centre. They were on corporate jobs, so it'd be interesting to go and see actually what it's like, and it would be interesting to sort of find people who could take you around and show you stuff. That would be fascinating. Right, coffee and an upload a video to Richard. Thank you very much, Turbo Stream. I will catch you soon. Take care, one and all. I will see you later, 8 o'clock on the Vogue Show. Bye bye for now. Bye bye.